Imagine it. The year is somewhere around 1600 BCE. You standing in the bustling city of Babylon, then one of the largest and most magnificent urban centers in the world. Dust swirls up in small clouds beneath the feet of goats, traders, priests, and schoolboys reciting memorized texts. The sun beats down on the pale mud brick streets, and above it all, gleaming faintly in the distance, the towering ziggurat of Etemenanke casts its long, steady shadow. In this golden, sunlit world, the people of ancient Mesopotamia were deeply attuned to the sky. Their gods lived up there, after Alanu, god of the heavens, among others, and their futures were written in the movements of planets and stars. But there was also something far more practical that they watched in the sky, the sun itself, because the Babylonians quietly, patiently learned to tell time by the sun's shadow. Timekeeping, to us, may seem the province of digital clocks and tiny quartz vibrations. But for the Babylonians, time was the sun's slow crawl across the dome of the heavens, and its predictable retreat across the rooftops and courtyards of their world. Their most basic tool, the humble shadow, or, more specifically, a gnomon, is just a fancy name for something very simple. A vertical stick or pillar stuck into the ground. As the sun moves through the sky, the stick casts a shadow that lengthens and shortens in a predictable way. If you know what you're looking at, the shadow tells you the time of day. The Babylonians weren't the first to use a gnomon, but they were the first to use it with real precision. They noticed, for example, that in the morning the shadow pointed westward and was long. By midday it was shortest and pointed due north, and then it slowly lengthened again toward the east as evening drew near. This wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was cosmological. The hours of sunlight and shadow were deeply symbolic, tied to omens, rituals, and agricultural rhythms. They even used gnomons to construct their temples, aligning sacred structures with sunrise or sunset at solstices. Wasn't just beautiful, it was spiritual engineering. Temples were oriented in harmony with the heavens. But let's take a moment and slow down even more. Imagine you're a temple apprentice, perhaps 13 years old, in a linen tunic to long for your legs. You're sweating under the Mesopotamian sun. Your task is to mark the shadow of the pillar every half hour, just as your teacher instructed. You drag your stylus through clay to mark its length, then step back into the shade of the courtyard wall to wait for the next movement. You do this over and over every day for a month. Eventually, the marks you make begin to form a predictable arc, a pattern. You notice it. Your teacher nods solemnly. "This is the language of the gods," he says. But it wasn't only religious. Babylonian astronomers, known as Umanj, used these shadow measurements for calendars and even for astrology. They recorded eclipse cycles, plotted star paths, and refined sundials to measure hours. Though the idea of 60 minutes in an hour seems arbitrary, it stems from their sexagesimal system base 60 counting, which they applied to both time and angle. The oldest known sundials, dating back to around 1500 BCE in Babylon, weren't fancy. They were little more than L-shaped stone slabs with inscriptions noting hour lines. But they worked, and they worked because people were willing to sit and wait and watch. In some temple courtyards, there were larger gnomon stone pillars or poles erected specifically for timekeeping. The high priests would often determine prayer times or schedule offerings based on the shadow's movement. Over time, these became part of civic life, too. Market hours, festivals, and fieldwork schedules were synchronized by these sun-measured hours. The concept of time itself was shifting, not just before noon or after the sun sets, but measurable, consistent blocks. An hour might not have always been 60 minutes. Depending on the season, it was more about dividing daylight evenly, but it was still a way to structure a day. And this idea spread. Greek philosophers later credited the Babylonians with influencing their own concepts of geometry and astronomy. Even the famous Greek sundials were, in part, built on shadow studies that had begun in the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. But let's return to the image of that young apprentice waiting patiently in the courtyard. He's beginning to understand that shadows, though silent, speak volumes. They stretch and shrink, marking the passage of something intangible, time. Yet this opens a question. If shadows measured time, who decided what time meant? You're still in Babylon. The sun hangs high over the sprawling rooftops of mud-brick homes and temple complexes. The Euphrates River snakes calmly in the distance, glinting in the heat. And somewhere inside the great temple precinct, perhaps near the shrine of Marduk, himself, a group of scholars sit cross-legged in the shade, poring over rows of clay tablets. Their fingers are stained with dried bitumen and clay dust, and the air smells faintly of baked bricks, ink, and the sweet sap of incense. These men scribes, astrologers, and priest-mathematicians are the elite intellectuals of the city. In Babylon, knowledge is power. And one of the most powerful forms of knowledge is the ability to predict the movements of the heavens and, by extension, to structure time on Earth. Shadow measuring wasn't just an idle practice, it was a discipline, and it fell under the domain of the learned scribes and astronomer priests who spent decades mastering cuneiform writing, celestial records, and advanced mathematics. They kept logs of shadow lengths at specific times of day and year, creating tables that served not only religious ritual, but administrative planning, agricultural scheduling, and even medical practices. Each morning, a temple assistant would likely check the position of the sun and record the gnomon's shadow length into a clay tablet. These logs weren't just for today. They were kept year after year, accumulating slowly into a rich record of solar data. Some of these tablets, remarkably, have survived. Modern archaeologists have studied them to reconstruct ancient Babylonian astronomical models with astonishing accuracy. By 700 BCE, Babylonian scholars had developed a remarkably sophisticated understanding of time and space. They could calculate solstices and equinoxes. They knew how long it took the sun to return to the same point in the sky, and from their shadow measurements, they even deduced variations in day length throughout the year. This wasn't yet a scientific revolution as we understand it, but it was methodical, precise, and surprisingly advanced. In fact, Babylonian scholars were among the first people to think of the day not as a single unit, but as something divisible. Some tablets describe divisions of the daylight period into 12 parts, with night similarly split, likely the origin of our modern 24-hour day. But unlike today's hours, ancient Babylonian hours changed length with the seasons. A summer hour might be longer than a winter hour because they divided daylight, not fixed time. So your workday in July might be 12 hours long, but longer in real time than your 12-hour winter day. This system seems confusing to us now, but it made perfect sense in a sun-centered world. Clocks, as we know them, didn't exist. There were no bells to mark the hour, no ticking hands to fret over, only the sky. And yet this flexible time wasn't disorganized. It was deeply embedded into city life. Contracts for laborers often specified how many hours of daylight they were expected to work. Temple rituals were timed according to solar position. Even judicial hearings and royal proclamations might be scheduled by the sun's shadow. In public life, gnomons may have been visible in central plazas, much like modern clock towers. People would learn to read the day by glancing at the way the temple cast its shadow across the square. In some cases, larger institutions' palaces, granaries, or courts likely had their own designated timekeepers. But the most sophisticated timekeeping remained in the hands of the temple elite. For them, shadows were a form of divine language. They didn't just measure time, they interpreted it. For instance, if the shadow of the temple obelisk was unusually short at a specific time, it might be recorded as an omen. If a shadow fell to the west at sunrise, an oddity caused by strange atmospheric light, it might be taken as a sign of divine displeasure. Shadow omens were sometimes listed in long compendiums with names like Enuma, Anu, and Lil, where priests recorded dozens of combinations of celestial and shadow events with their supposed meanings. If the shadow of the gnomon is split in two, famine in the south. So we arrive at something quietly profound. For the Babylonians, time wasn't abstract. It was alive. It had texture, shape, color, weight. It was something you could see, touch, measure, and also interpret. Even more intriguing, Babylonian shadow measuring fed directly into their lunar and planetary astronomy. While shadows tracked the sun, scribes also used shadow positions to help correct star charts and predict eclipses. In this way, the humble gnomon became part of a much larger celestial system, a bridge between the human and the divine. Let's not forget the scribes themselves. These weren't flamboyant prophets or charismatic preachers. They were quiet men, often trained from childhood, who spent their lives copying tables, comparing data, drawing lines, and noting slight shifts in shadow or star. Their handwriting, sharp, wedge-shaped cuneiform, was methodical and precise. Some tablets even show scribes correcting earlier entries or arguing over a measurement that didn't match expected values. Their patience, discipline, and curiosity gave birth to one of the earliest forms of regulated time. And though their names have long been lost to history, the legacy of their work endures every time we glance at a clock. And so, in the dusty silence of a Babylonian courtyard, a scribe lifts his head from a clay tablet and notices that the shadow has shifted again. He makes a final mark. The hour has changed, and with it, the world. But this leads us to wonder, how did Babylonian ideas of time survive and travel to influence future civilizations? You are no longer in Babylon. Or rather, you are, but it's centuries later. The great city has changed hands many times. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and now the Persians have all walked its sun-baked streets. Its towering ziggurat has crumbled, partially buried by the sands of time. But the knowledge first etched therein, clay meticulously, patiently, day after day has traveled. The Babylonian way of measuring time through shadows, of counting in 60s, of dividing the heavens into parts that matched hours on Earth, didn't disappear. It rippled outward, quietly, like the shadow of a gnomon at noon. Let's follow it. First, to Egypt. While the Babylonians were busy tracking shadows from gnomons, the Egyptians were developing their own methods. They too used sundials, but more often in the form of L-shaped horizontal dials or shadow clocks laid out in cardinal directions. The idea of dividing the day into equal parts was gaining traction, and some Egyptian shadow clocks even used seasonal hour marks similar to those used in Babylon. It's hard to say whether these techniques evolved in parallel or were shared, but either way, the sun remained the master. Then to Greece. By the 5th century BCE, Greek scholars, many of whom studied Babylonian astronomy, began incorporating this Mesopotamian knowledge into their own systems. They refined the sundial, introduced fixed-length hours, and applied geometry to improve shadow interpretation. The Greek word gnomon itself comes from this period, meaning one who knows. That upright stick had become a tool of wisdom. One famous example, the Tower of the Winds in Athens. Built in the 1st century BCE, it had 8 sundials, one on each side, long with a water clock inside for cloudy days. It was a civic timepiece, openly drawing from Mesopotamian models. The idea of measuring time through public instruments was now a symbol of order and knowledge. The Romans took it further. As they expanded their empire, they brought sundials to every corner from North Africa to Britain. One famous Roman, Marcus Vitruvius, even wrote a guide to constructing different types of sundials based on Babylonian geometry. But here, as something quietly amusing, when the Romans first brought a large sundial from Sicily to Rome in 263 BCE, they didn't recalibrate it for Rome's latitude. The shadow lengths were all wrong for their location, and yet it still stood for nearly a century before they bothered to fix it. Even with all their grandeur, they sometimes preferred the appearance of timekeeping over its accuracy. Still, the idea was now embedded into the public mind. Time could be measured, planned, and most revolutionary of all standardized. Eventually, of course, mechanical clocks replaced sundials. In medieval Europe, the advent of escapement mechanisms allowed for hour-by-hour ringing bells in monasteries. But even then, the division of time into 60-minute hours and 24-hour days, so central to our modern lives, was Babylonian in origin. Their base 60 system had proved astonishingly resilient, and yet the original spirit of Babylonian timekeeping, quiet, observational, patient, ever entirely vanished. We can trace their influence even farther. Islamic scholars of the Golden Age translated Babylonian and Greek astronomical works into Arabic, refining sundials and pushing forward the science of timekeeping. Indian astronomers incorporated Babylonian eclipse models into their own texts. Chinese court astronomers developed similar mnemonic methods, sometimes in dialogue with knowledge that had migrated along the Silk Roads, all from a stick in the dirt, a shadow, a careful series of marks on clay. Let's take one final slow step back. Try to picture what this meant for the ordinary people of Babylon, not just the scribes and priests. A baker, perhaps, rising when the first shadow of the ziggurat slipped down the eastern alleyways. A farmer in the fields, gauging when to head home by watching the angle of the sun's shadow stretch toward the city. A young couple timing a wedding by the moment the shadow met a temple column. Time was not mechanical. It was embodied. It was there, in the world, visible and alive. And for all the boredom that shadow measuring may seem to imply, it was also deeply human. It required someone to show up every day, to look, to note, to care. These were people who lived not by the ticking of minutes, but by the slow movement of light and the whisper of passing hours. Today, We rarely think of time as having texture. We glance at our phones or hear the beep of a microwave. But in Babylon, time lengthened and shortened, breathed with the seasons, and left its trace in the dust. The gnomons are gone. The temples are ruins. But somewhere, buried in clay tablets and absorbed into the rhythms of our modern lives, Babylon still casts its shadow. And so, you might wonder, if ancient people could feel the day changing just by watching the light shift, have we, with all our clocks and alarms, lost something quietly beautiful? Picture the Nile Valley. Sometime around 1300 BCE, the river moves slowly, glinting beneath the sun as papyrus reeds rustle in the breeze. On the western bank, where the sun sets and the dead dwell, there's a curious buzz of activity hammers tapping, men shouting, donkeys braying, and dust rising from stone. This is not a royal court or a battlefield, it's a worksite. Specifically, you're in the Valley of the Kings, where laborers are carving deep tombs into the bedrock for pharaohs of the new kingdom. But you're not here to witness death rites or grand inscriptions. You're here for something far more mundane: lunch. Because while the monuments of ancient Egypt were built to last for eternity, their builders still got hungry by midday. The tomb workers of Deir el-Medina, nearby village, specially built to house the artisans who labored on royal tombs, led surprisingly structured and well-documented lives. And among the most revealing details about their day-to-day existence, their food. So, what did an Egyptian tomb builder eat for lunch? To answer that, we need to step into the shoes of a man named Ka, not a noble, not a priest, but a skilled worker, stonecutter, or painter. Every morning, Ka and his co-workers would rise before dawn. They'd make the dusty trek over the hills to the worksite, tools in hand, often singing songs or chants as they walked. But unlike modern laborers clocking in at an anonymous job site, Ka's routine was regulated by a meticulous state bureaucracy. His attendance was tracked. His absences were noted, whether he was sick, offering to a god, or, amusingly, nursing his wife. By the time mid-morning rolled around, the work would pause. The sun was hot, the tools needed cooling, the men needed food. Lunch was typically taken on site, often in the shade of a carved stone shelter or a temporary awning. And it was surprisingly nutritious if repetitive. The staple, bread and beer, but not the soft, pillowy bread we imagine today. Ancient Egyptian bread, especially the kind supplied to workers, was dense, dark, and full of coarse grains. Often, it contained bits of sand and grit accidentally ground in during milling. Archaeologists have found evidence that this caused dental wear in even young adults. Still, it was filling, made from emmer, wheat, or barley, shaped into round loaves or flat discs, and often baked in communal clay ovens. Bread was the absolute cornerstone of the Egyptian diet. For a builder, it was both fuel and comfort. Alongside it came beer, but, again, not the bubbly beverage we picture. Egyptian beer was thick, porridge-like, and sometimes required straining through a reed to drink. It was made by partially baking loaves of bread, crumbling them into water, fermenting the mixture, and letting it settle. The result was nutritious, rich in B vitamins, and mildly alcoholic, though the alcohol content varied widely. For Ka, beer wasn't an indulgence, it was hydration. The desert sun was relentless, and water sources weren't always clean or convenient. Beer, made from boiled grains and aged in sealed jars, was far safer. But bread and beer weren't the only items on the menu. Some days, builders received rations of onions, garlic, and lentils, sometimes even dried fish or cuts of goat. These weren't daily offerings, but they rotated in as part of the state's controlled distribution. Payments were in kind, not coins. Your work earned you a set amount of food, calculated by rank and seniority. A foreman might get double rations. A plasterer might get more than a porter. And the scribes recorded everything in neat hieratic script. From preserved records, we know the exact quantities assigned. So many sacks of grain, so many jugs of beer. We even know what happened when workers didn't receive their proper rations. On multiple occasions, the tomb builders went on strike, among the earliest labor strikes recorded in human history. Imagine that, in a society ruled by divine kings, where disobedience could be fatal. Workers in Deir el-Medina simply refused to continue carving a royal tomb until they were given their food. They sat down, quietly, just outside the gates of the temple, and they waited. Their demands: more bread, more beer, possibly onions. It's oddly moving. These weren't slaves. They were trained artisans, painters, stonecutters, draftsmen who built the literal homes of eternity, and they knew their worth. Let's return to Ka. He sits in the shade, biting into a rough chunk of bread, sipping his beer from a clay jar. The wind kicks up a bit of dust. Nearby, a coworker jokes about the foreman's bad temper. Someone else unwraps a few figs, dried and sticky in the heat. It's a quiet, ordinary moment, but one that has echoed across time. Because in the middle of a world obsessed with gods, monuments, and eternal life, lunch still mattered. And this opens up a curious thought. If these laborers were so carefully fed and tracked, what does that say about the social structure and control of ancient Egypt? You're still in Egypt. The heat is heavy now. The sun sits high in the sky, casting long shadows behind the sandstone cliffs of the Theban necropolis. Deep inside the cliffs, the rhythmic tapping of chisels continues. Ka has finished his lunch and is back at work, shaping the curves of hieroglyphs along a tomb wall meant to last forever. But somewhere, not far from here, a scribe dips his reed brush into a pot of black ink and begins to write. He's recording today's food rations, because, in Egypt, food was power, and so was paperwork. The tomb builders of Deir el-Medina weren't ordinary peasants. They were state employees, part of a remarkably organized system that managed every detail of their lives, including their lunches. These workers didn't just show up and start carving. They were recruited, housed, paid, tracked, and perhaps most importantly, fed by a centralized administration that kept records with almost obsessive care. Let's step inside the bureaucratic machine. Each artisan in the workers' village was assigned specific daily rations, tallied carefully in chalk on astraca-broken pieces of pottery used like scrap paper or recorded in ink on scrolls of papyrus. These records still survive in remarkable condition. You can read entries like 4 men absent, 1 attending his mother's funeral, 1 ill, 2 brewing beer, 5 sacks of barley delivered to House of Ka, 2 loaves short, strike declared. No garlic received in 3 days. That's right, garlic. This was not a small annoyance. Garlic and onions were critical elements in the Egyptian diet, believed to bolster strength and ward off disease, the ancient equivalent of not getting your vitamin supplement. Even the distribution of onions was a state-managed affair. It might seem ridiculous, sundials and lentils being tracked like gold, but in a world where the pharaoh himself was considered a god, keeping his tomb workers healthy and loyal was a divine responsibility. Let's consider the scale. Deir el-Medina housed around 100 to 120 workers at any given time, including artisans, foremen, and support staff, along with their families. This meant feeding perhaps 400 to 600 people daily. Multiply that by a 10-day work week, and the logistics become impressive. Food rations came from royal granaries. Barley, emmer, oil, and other staples were shipped in on boats, offloaded, and distributed in standard vessels. The shape of your ration jar was carefully regulated. Standard size meant no cheating. Rations were not uniform either. They reflected hierarchy. A chief artisan might receive higher quality flour, more beer, and even honey. Lower-level laborers received coarse bread and sour beer. Women and children in the village received secondary rations through their husbands or fathers. The scribes of Deir el-Medina were deeply embedded in this food economy. They didn't just document deliveries, they adjusted them, arbitrated disputes, and sometimes, when shortages hit, had to calm a growing storm. Take, for example, they sat outside the mortuary temple of Thutmose III and refused to return until they were fed. Officials scrambled. Supplies were gathered. Bread and beer were delivered. The strike ended without bloodshed. This was over 3,000 years ago. It's one of the earliest documented labor actions in world history, and it was about lunch. But there's more to the story than just food. The regularity of lunch's expected arrival, the known taste and shape of the bread, the cool clay jar of beer was part of a larger promise. The state promised order. In exchange for loyalty and labor, it provided sustenance and structure. When that rhythm faltered, so did the sense of cosmic harmony. This brings us to another curious point: the spiritual role of food. Egyptian workers believed that nourishment wasn't just for the body, it was part of divine balance, or mat. When you ate, you participated in the same cycle as the gods. Bread fed the living, and offerings of bread fed the dead. Beer was poured for ancestors and consumed by workers alike. In tomb art, we often see servants bringing trays of food to the deceased: loaves, jars, onions, ducks. This wasn't symbolic, it was literal. The dead needed nourishment in the afterlife, just as the living did in life. So, in feeding the tomb workers, the state wasn't just managing labor, it was fueling a spiritual engine. Even the placement of meals had ritual echoes. Some tomb workers are believed to have eaten in proximity to the tombs they carved, in the very spaces where divine art was being made. The smell of roasted onions, the soft crackle of bread crusts, the bitter temps of barley beers were not distractions. They were part of the sacred texture of daily work. But there's an unresolved question here. If food was so essential, so measured and recorded and depended upon, what happened when the system faltered? When a drought hit? When the state overreached? When a foreman misappropriated rations? That's where we'll go next. The sky over the Valley of the Kings darkens, slightly not from a storm, but from dust blown across the desert by a warm, dry wind. In Deir el-Medina, the tomb workers' village, all seems quiet, but something is missing. The granary is late. The ration jars are empty. And on the clay, astraca scattered across the ground, the scribes have begun to write more anxiously. Lunch, for once, is not arriving. When we think of ancient Egypt, we often imagine stability pharaohs reigning for decades, pyramids enduring for millennia, the Nile flooding with mathematical regularity. But, like any complex civilization, ancient Egypt was vulnerable to disruption. And because food was managed centrally, any weakness in the system could bring everything to a halt. Famine was rare, but not unknown. Egypt relied on the annual flooding of the Nile to water its crops. When the river flooded to little or too much, entire harvests could be ruined. Grain shortages led to skyrocketing prices, and in a system where workers were paid not in silver or gold, but in sacks of barley, this was catastrophic. In one recorded case, a series of poor harvests in the reign of Ramesses IV caused prolonged food scarcity. Workers received partial rations, and sometimes none at all. Letters from Deir el-Medina scribes show complaints about empty granaries and stomachs that speak louder than orders. These weren't poetic flourishes, they were survival warnings, and hunger breeds dissent. We've already seen that the workers went on strike during Ramesses III's reign, but there were subtler forms of protest, too. Workers would take longer to return from lunch breaks. They'd complain of stomach aches. They'd miss shifts to forage or beg for scraps. Some even turned to fraud. Clay tablets from the late New Kingdom describe incidents where foremen were accused of skimming off the top of food deliveries. One official was found hoarding oil rations in hidden jars under his house. Another was caught falsifying bread counts, writing that 30 loaves had arrived when only 20 had. In a world where the state measured everything, where the weight of your onions was tracked, where the amount of beer in your jug was subject to verification, these small acts of corruption could trigger major unrest. And yet, despite the fragility of the system, it persisted for centuries. There's a reason for that: resilience. The workers of Deir el-Medina were not helpless cogs in a machine. They were organized. They had spokesmen. They knew how to negotiate. And crucially, they were literate. Many of them could read and write, which gave them power few other working-class groups in the ancient world possessed. When rations failed, they recorded it. When officials lied, they documented the discrepancies. When hunger loomed, they made their voices heard. And in most cases, the state responded, not always quickly, not always fairly, but often enough to restore balance. It is a quiet testimony to the importance of trust in food systems, even thousands of years ago. And while we're on the subject, it's worth noting that the tomb workers' lunch habits influenced how they saw the afterlife, too. In the tombs they carved, food is everywhere: painted loaves, jars of beer, baskets of figs and dates, cuts of meat offered to the deceased so they could eat for eternity. The same kinds of food these workers carried in cloth bundles or clay jars each day. When Ka finishes his life, he'll be buried with similar scenes. His tomb, modest but beautiful one, will show the offerings he expects to enjoy forever. Not golden feasts or luxury spreads, just bread, beer, onions. The same food he ate each day under the sun, crouched in the shade with stone dust in his hair. There's something humbling in that. In a world filled with colossal statues, endless desert horizons, and divine pharaohs, the humble Egyptian lunch, dense bread, gritty beer, and an onion or two, was a small but vital cornerstone of civilization. It was a daily ritual that nourished more than just the body. It anchored a workforce, revealed a bureaucracy, inspired protest, shaped the afterlife, and reminded us that even in the shadows of the tombs of kings, people still got hungry. And so, the next time you unwrap your sandwich or open a container of leftovers, you might consider Ka and his co-workers. Their lunches were ordinary, yes, but they built eternity on full stomachs, which makes you wonder what other ancient workers left behind legacies hidden in the simple rituals of daily meals. You are a Roman soldier, not a general, not a senator, not even a cavalryman. You are a Miles Gregarious, a common foot soldier. You wake before dawn, pack up your gear, hoist your shield, and march, and march, and march. Because the empire doesn't expand itself, but after the sun has scorched the backs of your legs and the sandals have worn down one more layer of sole, you reach the next campsite. And it's there that the unsung business of the Roman army truly begins, not with swords or standards, but with sleep. The Roman legion was a marvel of logistics, discipline, and forward planning, and this included sleep. After a long day as march, sometimes 20 miles or more, the first task of a Roman soldier was in tea rest. It was construction. Even in enemy territory, and even when exhausted, soldiers were required to build a fortified Campo Castro before they could sleep. It was like pitching tents. If your tent came with a moat, each soldier had a designated job. Some dug trenches, others drove stakes, some hauled earth. The perimeter had to be squared off, gates had to be set up, and watchtowers erected, all with military precision. Only after the camp was complete could you set up your own leather tentalo, squat structure, usually shared by a group of 8 men, called a contubernium. The word contubernium comes from the Latin taberna, meaning hut or tent. These 8 soldiers ate together, marched together, fought together, and yes, slept side by side, usually on the ground, their bedding, a farcically thin mattress, often just a folded cloak or a straw-filled sack, laid over a patch of dirt or gravel. If they were lucky, the ground was dry. If not, well, you'd just roll over and try not to think about it. Despite its simplicity, this system worked. Tents were arranged in strict rows. Senior officers were housed near the center, close to the standards and shrines. Common soldiers, like you, were arranged by unit near the edges, ready to defend the camp if needed. Inside the tent, there was no real privacy. Everyone slept in full view of their comrades, and often fully clothed. You might remove your sandals, maybe your belt, but rarely your tunic. After all, surprise attacks were not uncommon, and nobody wanted to scramble for armor in the dark. And speaking of dark, once the fires burned low and sentries were posted, a great hush would fall over the camp. Thousands of men tucked themselves into rough woolen cloaks, surrounded by snoring comrades, the soft rustle of canvas, and the distant hoots of nightbirds. It was not a comfortable sleep, but it was predictable. The Romans believed in order, even in unconsciousness. Officers ensured lights were out at a certain hour. Sentries rotated through 4 vigilia watches of the night each, lasting roughly 3 hours. And if you were unlucky enough to be assigned to the final watch, you'd have just a few short hours of rest before the tuba blared to signal sunrise. One Roman military manual, De Munitionibus Castrorum, lays out in tedious but enlightening detail how every camp should be laid out, how shifts should rotate, and how the soldiers should store their gear so they could grab it in the dark. Even the emperor's tent, when he traveled with the army, followed this same pattern. A folding bed, a modest table, and a servant or two who also doubled as bodyguards. Not exactly palace living, but sleep was never meant to be luxurious in the field, and the Romans didn't romanticize sleep, they managed it. For them, sleep wasn't a sacred escape or a time for dreams. It was a discipline, something that had to be earned, structured, and, if necessary, sacrificed. When crossing the Alps, Julius Caesar's soldiers reportedly slept in shifts, leaning against boulders. In the heat of desert campaigns, soldiers sometimes took naps in shallow pits, dug into the sand cooler than tents, and easier to abandon. One particularly vivid description from the historian Vegetius reminds us that Roman soldiers trained to sleep in full armor, to prepare for nighttime ambushes. That's right, mail shirt, helmet, sword belt, the whole ensemble. Comfort wasn't the goal, survival was. Still, even among the hardest of men, there were rituals. Some legionaries rubbed their feet with oil before bed to stave off blisters. Others drank a bit of sour wine to numb sore limbs. And a few, if their tentmates allowed it, carried small charmza carved bone figurine, a ring from home, a sliver of laurel for luck. Because even Roman soldiers needed reminders of peace in the silence before sleep. So tonight, as you lie beneath the stars, the distant crackle of a campfire in your ears, you roll your cloak tighter around your shoulders. Mutter a brief word to the household gods you've stashed in a pouch and tried to drift off, and yet to wonder, how did these rigid sleep routines affect morale? What happened when the nights weren't so peaceful? So the stars are high over the Roman Castro, the orderly, square-shaped camp, your fellow legionaries raised from nothing in just a few hours. You're finally lying down, wool cloak wrapped tightly, the cold seeping in through the thin leather floor of the tent. And then the voice comes. Third, watch on your feet. You groan. It's your turn to stand vigil. The Romans divided the night into 4 watches: prima vigilia, secunda vigilia, tertia vigilia, and quarta vigilia. The coldest, loneliest stretch of darkness. You sit up slowly, a stretch of darkness. You sit up slowly. Your back aches from the rocky ground. Your shoulders are stiff from the day's march. And the wool cloak that kept you barely warm during sleep now feels even thinner in the open air. Still, you wrap it around you like armor and head for the camp's edge, toward your assigned post. Every guard was responsible for a small stretch of the perimeter trench or palisade, just long enough to pace back and forth, turn and repeat, over and over and over again. No talking, no fire, just pacing and listening. The dull routine of the night watch was intentional. The Roman army believed discipline didn't end when the sun went down. If anything, the darkness was a test of character, and failing that test, not an option. In fact, falling asleep on watch in the Roman army was one of the few offenses punishable by death. There were no excuses, no sympathetic ears. You could bring down the entire camp by nodding off for even a moment. So soldiers learned strategies. They chewed on bitter herbs, rubbed snow on their faces, whispered Latin riddles to themselves under their breath. Some pressed small pebbles into their sandals sharp, uncomfortable, and just distracting enough to keep the eyelids open. Some sang very quietly under their breath, almost like humming the same tune again and again, not to stay awake so much as to feel less alone. There's a kind of strange beauty to it, the way each man, wrapped in his own shivering thoughts, became a tiny fragment of the empire's vast machinery. You weren't just guarding your comrades, you were holding up the entire Roman system. Even emperors like Augustus and Hadrian, who traveled with their troops, observed the watch rotation schedules personally. walking the camp in disguise to make sure no man had slacked off. Imagine being the poor soldier who got caught dozing by the emperor himself. Of course, not all posts were terrifying. If you were lucky, your stretch of the watch was along a forest line, where owls hooted softly and the trees whispered in the wind. If you were unlucky, next to the latrine trench. Yes, the Romans built proper latrines in their mobile camps, often with drainage ditches, but no amount of clever engineering could hide the smell from a sentry stuck nearby. Standing guard with one eye on a dark tree line and the other on a steaming trench was a uniquely Roman discomfort. But what of the rest of the tent? The 7 other soldiers not on watch. Most were sound asleep till they weren't. Roman military sleep was punctuated by interruptions, a dropped weapon, a shout from the sentry, the distant scream of some wild animal, one man tossing in his sleep, another swearing under his breath about fleas. Ah yes, the fleas, lice, and biting flies were a constant nuisance. Even the best-groomed soldiers couldn't avoid them. Before sleep, it was common to see legionaries inspecting their tunics and cloaks, squashing whatever parasites they found with the casualness of a man cracking knuckles. Fleas were so common that some soldiers developed sleep rituals around them, like shaking out their bedding 3 times before lying down, or rubbing vinegar into their skin. It rarely worked. The bugs returned, as relentless as any invading barbarian. Comfort was not the point. Sleep was a maintenance task, like sharpening swords or oiling shields. But there were occasional luxuries. In stationary camps, or after a major victory, the army might set up semi-permanent quarters. These were often wood or stone barracks, with straw-filled mattresses and small hearths. Soldiers could sleep off the ground, eat hot meals, and even decorate their sleeping areas with personal tokens, a carved pendant, a loved one's letter, or a small bronze figurine of Jupiter or Mars. In these moments of stillness, some soldiers would swap stories by firelight before crawling into bed, mostly about family, home, or dreams of retirement. The ultimate prize wasn't glory, it was land, a farm, and uninterrupted sleep under your own roof. Some men slept deeply, others barely at all. There are records of veterans who never got used to peace and quiet after service. The silence of civilian life felt more alien than the howling winds of a Gallic winter. One even wrote that he missed the routine of the company of men too tired to talk and too loyal to rest. Back in your tent, your shift ends. You wake the next man, murmur your turn, and hand off the watch duty. Then you ease yourself back onto the hard earth, pull your cloak up again, and attempt to drift off. Your breath joins the other slow breaths in the tent, the sounds of sleep overlapping like waves. In a few hours, the horn will blow. The march will begin again. But for now, there's still a little darkness left to enjoy. And still, you wonder, how did soldiers manage sleep when under siege? Or worse, on the move through hostile terrain with no camp at all? So, you've left the relative comfort of the marching camp behind. No walls of turf and sharpened stakes. No neat rows of tents. No buzzing campfires. No assigned watches. Just the open road, or worse, enemy territory. Now, the rules of sleep shift dramatically. Sleep becomes something you steal, not something you settle into. Picture this. You and your fellow legionaries are moving through dense Germanic forest. The terrain is thick, unfamiliar, and wet. The march never ends. It only pauses. And when it pauses, you sit. Then you slump. Then you nap. if you can, leaning against your own pack while someone else mutters nervously about ambushes. Sleep under these conditions wasn't even considered sleep in the Roman sense. It was called rest for the eyes, just enough to keep the body from collapsing. Officers called for what they termed short halts. These were 10 to 15-minute pauses during forced marches, long enough to relieve yourself, check your sandals, eat a dried fig, and maybe shut your eyes for a minute before the horn sounded again. In harsher climates, snowy mountains, rain-soaked lowland soldiers had to adapt further. Cloaks were soaked and the ground turned to mud. Instead of laying out neat camps, soldiers often huddled together for warmth, pressed shoulder to shoulder like livestock, breath fogging in the cold air. Wrap your wet cloak tighter and try not to dream about fires that never started and blankets that didn't exist. In these moments, ingenuity took over. Some soldiers stacked shields over branches to make makeshift lean-tos. Others burrowed shallow trenches to escape the wind. A clever legionary might use his scutum, that broad, curved shield, not just for defense, but as a kind of windbreak. The Romans didn't always sleep well, but they slept strategically. Now, consider the worst scenario: siege conditions. If your legion was defending a fortified city or a fort under attack, sleep became a negotiation with fear. The walls were manned constantly. Night and day, someone had to be watching. Sleep was permitted only in snatches, and only for those not on immediate duty. A typical pattern was 2 hours on, 2 hours off, but these were often interrupted by alarms, enemy movements, or the sudden crash of siege engines. Soldiers might be roused from slumber to reinforce a crumbling wall, or to douse a fire lit by flaming arrows. Helmets still on, boots never removed, they would leap from near sleep into full action with barely a moment's notice. Sleepwalking wasn't common, but sleep-witching was. The constant anxiety, the ever-present threat, and the toll of sleeplessness produced a kind of waking dream. Legionaries would close their eyes and feel themselves still marching, or dream of arrows falling, even when no attack had come. And what about after the battle? You might imagine a victorious legion relaxing around fires, feasting, then sleeping in blissful relief. Sometimes that happened. Roman commanders knew the value of morale, and celebrations were occasionally permitted after great victories. But often, sleep came not from peace, but from sheer exhaustion. Imagine a battle where you'd marched for miles, fought for hours, hauled supplies, built defenses, and buried the dead. Then, with your hands still shaking and your armor streaked with blood and mud, you collapsed next to the remains of a broken siege wall and finally slept. No tent, no bedding, just the sky, the hard earth, and whatever dreams came to a body too tired to resist them. In the Roman mindset, this was not just acceptable, it was noble. The poet Virgil wrote of warriors who slept on their shields beneath the stars, not with sorrow, not with complaint, but with pride. Sleep in the Roman army was never about luxury. It was about durability. Legionaries were trained to sleep lightly, rise quickly, and move efficiently. Even in rare moments of calm, they slept in full tunic, belt, dagger, sandals, ready to be roused by the sound of the trumpet or the scream of a panicked recruit. This conditioning made Roman legions nearly unmatched in flexibility. They could march by day, build a camp at sunset, sleep in a new place every night, and still function with mechanical precision. Compare this to some of their enemy's tribal armies, less organized, often bound by local geography, or reliant on familiarity with terrain. The Romans slept everywhere, and because of that, they could fight anywhere. And that's the deeper story, isn't it? It's not just how they fought, it's how they endured. How they lay in the mud, bugs in their cloaks, stomachs half full, and still managed to rise and form ranks the next morning with square shields and measured steps. When you lie awake at night, now perhaps on a too soft mattress, scrolling your modern distractions, think for a moment of the Roman soldier scratching bug bites, shivering in a borrowed cloak, muttering a prayer to Mars, and settling into a few stolen hours of uneasy sleep, not dreaming of conquest, just hoping the next shift doesn't come too soon. And so, with this in mind, what can the sleep of a Roman legionary teach us about the power of routine, even in chaos? You are standing on a narrow dirt road somewhere in the mountains of Sichuan. The mist clings low to the earth. It's cold, damp, the kind of damp that seeps through your cloak, your sleeves, your boots, but you do not stop. You cannot, because strapped to your chest is a sealed bamboo cylinder, and inside it a message. Not just any message. This one carries an imperial seal. It was written, copied by scribes in a palace hundreds of miles to the east, and placed into your hands with a single solemn instruction: go quickly, do not delay. Welcome to the life of a Ming Dynasty courier. You might think of the postal service as something modern: mail trucks, uniforms, sorting machines, but China had a complex and far-reaching state communication network long before envelopes or airmail were imagined. By the time the Ming Dynasty was in full swing in the 15th century, their courier system had already evolved over thousands of years. The emperor ruled from Beijing or, earlier, Nanjingba. His word had to reach the far corners of the empire: desert outposts, mountain passes, river ports, and small farming villages. And not just eventually. It had to reach them reliably and fast. The solution was the Yichuan Sistema, massive, tightly regulated chain of relay stations, horse posts, and official inns that stretched like capillaries across the map of China. Each courier, called a zuma, or galloping horse rider, was trained to move quickly, efficiently, and without deviation. But let's not mistake this for glamour. The journey was not one of gallant adventure or glorious quest. It was, in fact, deeply repetitive. You were handed the dispatch. You traveled to the next station. You passed it on or continued. No frills, no detours, no time for sightseeing, and certainly no sleep without permission. The Ming courier system functioned with a kind of bureaucratic elegance. Each relay station was spaced roughly 30 to 40 li apart. That's about 10 to 15 kilometers. Why? Because that's about how far a man or horse could travel quickly without wearing out. So at each post, a courier could swap mounts, rest briefly, and continue, or pass the dispatch to a fresh courier entirely. It was less like one person galloping across the empire and more like a relay race, with each runner precisely trained to pass the baton. The baton, in this case, was often a sealed tube made of bamboo or lacquered wood, tied with red string, bearing wax stamps or ribbon codes indicating its urgency. These weren't just letters. They were edicts, orders, tax instructions, updates on grain shipments, flood reports, military activity, or even the emperor's personal communications. And timing was everything. There were 4 speeds in the courier system, labeled with alarming directness: slow, hasty, very hasty, thunderbolt, yes, thunderbolt. Post was the highest urgency category. These messages were to be delivered at all hours, non-stop, with riders required to move day and night. In extreme cases, stations were alerted in advance, and relays were prepared ahead of the courier's arrival. That means a message could move from Beijing to Yunnan over 2,000 kilometers in just a few days. No trucks, no airplanes, just sheer determination and a finely tuned bureaucratic machine. Of course, it didn't always go smoothly. The terrain could be brutal. Flooded rivers, collapsed bridges, snow-blocked mountain paths. A courier might reach a station and find no fresh horse, or worse, a corrupt innkeeper asking for a bribe. And always there was the threat of bandits. For all its order, Ming China was still dotted with lawless zones. Couriers often carried swords, not for show, but for real defense. Losing a message or failing to deliver was a serious offense. In some cases, capital punishment, serious, and sleep. Sleep was highly regulated. Couriers weren't free to rest when they wished. Records were kept at every station: time of arrival, time of departure, condition of the message tube, name and rank. Too long a delay, and you'd be summoned for questioning. Sleep became a calculated luxury, a half hour on a straw mat, while a new horse was watered and fed, an hour in an official bunk if the next rider wasn't ready. Meals, too, were often eaten standing or riding. No one romanticized the job, but it was vital. The empire ran on words, and words traveled on horses. And then there were the quiet hours, the boredom, the isolation, the endless repetition of winding roads and distant inns. Imagine riding through fog across the salt flats of northern China. Nothing but wind and the occasional outline of a low wall or empty tower. Or imagine galloping through monsoon rains along the Yangtze River Valley, soaked, cold, unable to see your own hands. You keep riding because you must, because the message must arrive, and because, somewhere in the distance, a red lantern marks the next post, where perhaps, just perhaps, you'll be permitted to sleep, not for long, but just enough to close your eyes and let the echoes of hooves fade into dreams of home, warmth, and a day when someone else will carry the burden. But what kind of person signs up for such a life? In the next section, we'll explore the daily life of the couriers, their training. Imagine the door opening at dawn. You are awakened not by a gentle sunbeam or the smell of rice porridge, but by the curt voice of a station overseer checking his wooden tally board. He's here to see if you're ready to depart on time. You rise, you eat quickly if you're lucky, a bowl of millet congee, maybe a sliver of dried pork. No lingering, no idle talk. Outside, your horse is being bridled, its mane damp with morning dew. The bamboo cylinder is brought out sealed, stamped, untouched. Today, you carry a hasty dispatch, marked with a red thread. That means you're expected to move faster than normal, but not so fast that you bypass protocol. You'll still need to report at each station, still need to check in and out like clockwork. Your uniform, if you're wearing it properly, includes a short jacket marked with the courier seal, thin cotton trousers, cloth shoes, and a leather belt to hold your knife or sword. Not luxurious, not ceremonial. Designed for movement and endurance, not comfort. So who were these men? Some were born into the system, others conscripted. A few volunteered, attracted by the relative prestige of serving the imperial post and the small stipends offered. But let's not mistake it for wealth. Most couriers were from humble backgrounds, farmers' sons, minor bureaucrats, or soldiers reassigned to logistics. It was hard work, unrelenting, underpaid, yet in the bureaucratic machinery of the Ming Empire, it was also an essential cog. To become a Zuma, literally a galloping horse, you had to pass an inspection of physical fitness. You needed to know how to ride, how to care for a horse, how to read simple characters, and how to follow protocol exactly. You were not an adventurer. You were an extension of the emperor's will, galloping through river valleys and over snowy ridges, carrying not your own thoughts, but those of the court. Every courier was bound by a strict code of conduct, detailed in imperial regulations known as the Yezhan Fa Ko. You were forbidden from opening or tampering with messages. Punishment, imprisonment, sometimes worse. You were forbidden from talking about the contents of your deliveries, even if you overheard something while changing hands. You were forbidden from stopping at unapproved locations, sleeping too long, or deviating from your assigned route. If your horse died en route, you were expected to walk to the next station and report the cause immediately. No excuses. If you were robbed, you had to prove it. Fabricating a robbery, that was capital crime territory. And the stations kept logs. They recorded your name, time of arrival, state of the message tube, your horse's condition, and any delay down to the quarter hour. This wasn't casual correspondence. It was logistics as statecraft. Of course, not all couriers were riders. Some worked as station clerks, grooms, or messengers' assistants. In large stations, near cities, a small staff operated round the clock to house and feed travelers, prepare fresh mounts, and maintain the registers. Every station, even the smallest, had to be ready, at a moment's notice, for a thunderbolt dispatch. There were even relief riders kept on standby in case of emergency, illness, or injury, because the show couldn't stop. And like many bureaucratic systems, the courier network developed a culture of unseen pressure. Station masters were expected to keep things flowing. Riders knew delays would be punished. Yet, in spite of the rules, or perhaps because of them, a kind of quiet pride grew within the ranks. They knew their work mattered, because when rebellions broke out in far provinces, it was the couriers who carried orders from the capital to the commanders. When drought struck, they delivered the petitions and rice allotments. When an emperor died or an heir was chosen, it was their galloping hooves that carried the news to every corner of the realm, all in bamboo tubes, sealed and string-tied. Then there were the dangers beyond paperwork: floods, snowstorms, and the infamous bandits of the borderlands. To ride alone for 30 li on a back mountain path, with nothing but a blade and your speed, required not just strength but also nerves of iron. And while bandits may not have cared about imperial memos, they often robbed couriers for their horses, clothes, or food, or simply out of boredom. Which meant a courier had to judge situations carefully, avoid a fight, defend the message, run for the next post. Sometimes, unfortunately, they failed. But the real consequences, execution, punishment, forced labor, didn't always fall on them alone. If an entire station failed to uphold protocol, it could be shut down and its employees dismissed or fined. In some cases, village elders were held accountable if their area failed to protect a rider from harm. The courier system was, in every way, a state institution. It relied not just on couriers, but on the cooperation of entire communities' innkeepers, farmers, stable hands, even ferrymen. Every village knew, if the courier is delayed, the empire is delayed. But despite the pressure, the miles, the weather, and the rules, there was something enduring about it. The couriers became part of the landscape, known by the tollkeepers, saluted by officials, welcomed at the inns. Their horses left worn trails on dusty roads, their footfalls recorded in ledgers that historians still read today. And it wasn't just state business. Some special couriers were also assigned to deliver gifts, tribute, examination results, or even poetry competitions between regional scholars. Because even in a tightly run empire, someone still had to carry a sonnet from Hangzhou to the capital. But what happened when the messages stopped? What became of the system as the Ming dynasty declined? How did this mighty network vanish or transform when new technologies arrived? That's where we'll go next. In the final section of this story, we'll explore the slow unraveling of the courier system, the arrival of foreign mail practices, and what traces of the ancient riders still remain today. So we return to the Trelawney now. It's quieter, not silent, just ... less certain. It's the late Ming period, perhaps the early 1600s. The roads are still there, the relay stations still staffed, the bamboo cylinders still pass hand to hand. But something has shifted. The empire is fraying at its edges. The imperial budget, stretched thin from years of military campaigns, lavish court expenditures, and natural disasters, begins to cut funding to the courier system. Horses are no longer replaced as frequently. Stations become understaffed. Riders fall ill and aren't always replaced. And then there is corruption. What once ran with military precision now begins to sag under the weight of favoritism, local interference, and the quiet privatization of services. A governor might pull a few horses from the official post system to serve his own messengers. A station master might accept a bribe to delay one dispatch and prioritize another. The bureaucracy that once fueled 1,000 hooves begins to trip over its own paperwork. At the same time, outside forces are pressing in. The Portuguese have set up shop in Macau, and Jesuit missionaries are traveling deep into the interior, bringing with them tales of strange European system-sealed envelopes, coded dispatches, and even portable timepieces to measure travel speed. The Chinese officials are curious, but wary. Some ideas are absorbed, others dismissed. After all, why would an empire that has managed internal communications for 2,000 years adopt the strange habits of Westerners? Yet time, like a galloping horse, cannot be stopped. Then comes the ultimate test. The fall of the Ming dynasty in 1644. As rebel forces rise and the Manchu armies sweep through the north, the old courier routes become battlegrounds. Stations are burned, horses stolen, and roads left impassable. Messages stop reaching their destinations. Dispatch riders are lost, not just in duty, but to history itself, their names unrecorded, their cargoes scattered. The Ming system collapses, and in its place rises the Qing dynasty, founded by the Manchus who bring with them their own practices, borrowing from both Chinese and nomadic systems of communication. They revive parts of the Ming courier structure, especially in the north, but with heavy alterations. They introduce a banner system, tie courier duties more tightly to military logistics, and increase oversight from central Manchu officials. The bones of the old system remain, but the soul has changed. By the 1800s, the age of the imperial courier is truly waning. Steamships begin appearing along the rivers. Foreign post offices, French, Russian, set up along the coast, offering faster and more flexible services. Railroads, though limited at first, start carving new paths through the countryside. And then there is paper, so much paper. Commercial printing presses boom, and suddenly letters are not just the domain of officials. Merchants, families, and even poets start sending mail through parallel, informal systems. By the late Qing period, private courier companies, many of them run by merchant guilds or Buddhist temples, are operating in nearly every province. These letter shops sometimes outperform the state post in efficiency, though never in formality. The imperial post tries to adapt. It establishes new postal regulations, issues official stamps, and even introduces a prototype mailbox system in the early 20th century. But it's too late. The world has changed, and the echo of hoofbeats fades into the mud of history. Yet the legacy remains. Visit the countryside in Shanxi or Hubei, and you may still find the stone foundations of old courier stations. In certain museums, the bamboo cylinders, cracked and faded, sit behind glass. In dusty archives, the travel logs and relay registers of anonymous riders lie in forgotten drawers. Even the language bears traces. The modern word for post office in Chinese Yoju contains the old character for postal relay, a nod to the system that once carried the voice of an empire across thousands of li. And perhaps the most enduring legacy is the idea itself, that a message once sent deserves to arrive, that no matter how vast a land or how heavy the scroll, the task must be done with care, that a nation to function must not just speak but be heard. All this from dusty horses and narrow roads, from men in plain jackets carrying bamboo tubes, from a network that knew no glory yet held the threads of a dynasty together. As the sun sets over the last way station and the hoofprints fade from the trail, one final question lingers gently in the air. What messages are we sending today that future centuries will try to understand?